Okay, welcome. Yeah, we're chapter 10 of Genesis, and we just finished the story of Noah, and we're about to start the Table of Nations. We're going to go pretty quick because this is one of those passages that people's eyes start to kind of glaze over when they read this. But it is fairly interesting, and it is somewhat remarkable historically. I was reading here in good old Gerhard von Rad, who's he's one of the greatest Old Testament scholars of the 1900s, German Lutheran theologian and Bible scholar. He says that this passage here is almost unique in ancient history of society. Societies at this time often compiled, for example, lists of the cities that they had conquered. You see this in Egypt and Assyrian records of, these are the people we went to war against, and we beat this city and we conquered that city and so on. But this list is comprehensive, and it goes all the way to Nubia, which is south of Egypt. It goes up to the Black Sea. It goes very far east, all not quite to India, but all the way to the almost the Far East by our standards, and then all the way to the Mediterranean coast of Spain. And for a small nation of people like Israel was, and an inland nation really, because the Philistines had a lot of the coast of Israel. This is just a small collection of 12 tribes, and relative to these other nations, to have a list of nations that spans that amount of geography and that's that comprehensive, according to Von Rad, there's no other example of that in history. Even the great empires didn't kind of have anything comparable to this. So I know it's boring, but it's yes. This list was probably made that we're about to read in Genesis 10. Some parts of it may have been as old as the 9th century BC, and other parts of it were probably from the 6th century BC. But still, 6th century BC. That's well before Alexander the Great, well before the Roman Empire, and so I just think that's somewhat interesting historically. And like I said, it's welcome. We're reading the list of the nations, and I was just sharing that according to the scholars, this list of nations is the most comprehensive ancient list that we have from the time period. Even the great empires didn't have lists like this. So let's read it. Again, I'm going to go fast. There's going to be some strange names and names of strange people that nobody remembers. So chapter 10. This is the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, who themselves had sons after the flood. The sons of Japheth: Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. The sons of Gomer: Ashkenaz, Riphah, and Togarmah. The sons of Javan: Elisha, Tarshish, the Kittim, and the Rodanim. From these the maritime peoples spread out into their territories by their clans within the nations, each with its own language. The Hamites: the sons of Ham: Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. The sons of Cush: Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Raamah, and Sabteka. The sons of Ramah: Sheba and Dedan. Cush was the father of Nimrod, who grew to be a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The first centers of his kingdom were Babylon, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in Shinar. From that land he went to Assyria, where he built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Ir, Calah, and Rezin, which is between Nineveh and Calah. That is the great city. So even back then, Nineveh was known as a great city. Mizraim was the father of the Ludites, Anamites, Lehabites, Naphtuhites, Pathrusites, Casluhites, from whom the Philistines came. We know the Philistines, that's familiar. And Caphtorites. Canaan was the father of Sidon, his firstborn, and of the Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, Girgashites, Hivites, Arkites, Sinites, Arvadites, Zemarites, and Hamathites. Those are the Canaanite people. And they'll be important later on because they're the people who Israel is going to have to conquer after it comes back out of Egypt. Later, the Canaanite clans scattered, and the borders of Canaan reached from Sidon toward Gerar as far as Gaza, and then towards Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, as far as Lasha. These are the sons of Ham by their clans and languages in their territories and nations. The Semites, sons were also born to Shem. Now this is us. This is where the people of Israel are going to come from. Born to Shem, whose older brother was Japheth. Shem was the ancestor of all the sons of Eber. The sons of Shem, Elam, Ashur, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. The sons of Aram, Uz, Hul, Gether, and Meshech. Arphaxad was the father of Shelah, and Shelah the father of Eber. The two sons were born to Eber. One was named Peleg, because in his time the earth was divided. His brother was named Joktan. Joktan was the father of Almadad, Sheleph, Hazar-Maveth, Jerah, Hadoram, Uzal, Diklah, Obal, Abimael, Sheba, Ophir, Havilah, and Jobab. All these were sons of Joktan. The region where they lived stretched from Misha towards Sephar in the eastern hill country. These are the sons of Shem by their clans and languages in their territories and nations. These are the clans of Noah's sons according to their lines of descent within their nations. From these, the nations spread out over the earth after the flood. There's two things to point out here. First is who between Seth is our ancestor, meaning ours, Israel's. Was he the elder or the younger brother? Did you catch that? He was what? Yes, yes. He's not the eldest, right? And that's a theme, isn't it? Well, if it's not now, you're going to see it is. In Genesis, the theme is that the younger brother is favored. The younger sibling is favored. And that's, in a sense, shows us in human culture, the elder brother is favored. Yeah. The elder brother receives the inheritance. But God, what this is telling us is that this is not according to man. This does not come from human origins. God is choosing the younger sibling, the one that is not according to human standards, the one to be chosen, the one to receive the inheritance. That's who God chooses. And so it's signaling that this is God's operation, not just human beings. And the second thing I said, there's two things. The second thing is, this is, if you look at the very end, these are the clans of Noah's sons according to their lines of descent within their nations. From these, the nations spread out over the earth after the flood. That's a fulfillment of the commandment to multiply and fill the earth, right? They spread out over the earth. So you're seeing at least the command to increase and multiply and fill the earth being fulfilled. That's about all we're good at. That's about the only command that we're good at obeying. Every other command we struggle with, but we're good at that, and at least we've got that far. So this table of nations is showing us the background of all the nations really throughout the ancient Near East. It's showing us, though, that God is active in elevating the younger brother over the elder. And that the same thing, right, happens between Isaac and Esau, right? It also happens with Jacob had 12 sons, and his favorite son is Joseph, who's not the eldest, right? So, yeah. All right. Any comments, questions there on the table of nations? I have a little, I want to share with you another meditation about this theme of siblings in Genesis. This is from a rabbi I like to read, Rabbi David Wolpe. He says, "Why does the Torah so often tell the tales of siblings? From Cain and Abel, the Genesis stories, we've already talked about some of them, on to Moses and Aaron, who are brothers, we are being told something important about human nature. Ultimately, our lives are shaped by our choices. Yes, there are differences in families and circumstances. Some people undoubtedly have a much more difficult road than others. Yet the Torah, the Bible, teaches that even when people grow up in the same family and have similar experiences and opportunities, who they become is who they choose to be. Everything, says the Talmud, is in the hands of heaven except the fear of heaven. In other words, your moral character and decisions are not a product of your environment, but of your will. This is a message of empowerment. You can overcome the most difficult challenges if you believe in your own ability to forge your destiny. Every human being is made in the image of God. Whether we honor that image or sully it, however, is not God's choice. It is ours. We do not choose the blessings we inherit, but we do choose the blessings we become." So you have all these stories of siblings, from Cain and Abel to Isaac and Esau, Jacob and his 12 sons that are siblings. And it's showing us that, each of these siblings chooses their own way. Yeah, they have the same parents and they're made in the image of God, but their choices determine their destiny. And none of these siblings choose the same path. And so I think that that's part of the reason why we have so many stories of siblings in Genesis. Genesis is really the story of family. And we'll have a lot of sibling relationships to look at in Genesis as we keep reading. Okay, I'm going to pick up chapter 11. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As men moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Now I'm going to pause, that was a bit of an advance in technology, right? Laying stones on top of each other is kind of the most primitive form, but these people are now using an advanced technology, and they're using an advanced technology to build something. So they've got brick instead of stone and tar for mortar, sort of the precursor to concrete, which we know the Romans did some amazing things with. Anyway, verse 4, then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth." So that's their motive. Let's build a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens. Now, there's nothing here that we shouldn't get too creative or spiritual with our interpretation. Reaching to the heavens, I think here simply means a tall tower. I don't think that they were trying to invade heaven or something or take over God's realm. It's just a figure of speech saying, let's build a city and a tall tower the way people do, to show how great we are, how powerful we are, how creative we are, to express our glory. And ancient societies, anyone, you traveled the world or you study them in school, ancient civilizations did this. We do this sort of thing. There's a giant tower in Washington, D.C., right? We build structures that symbolize our identity and our glory.
Seems like there's a competition to see which city has the tallest skyscraper.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, maybe it's China, or it used to be one in the Middle East, and I don't know. Yeah, I'm not up on that. But same thing. Human nature doesn't change, right? So that's what they do. Verse 5. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the men were building. And that's, again, we have this sort of anthropomorphism, God being pictured in human terms. It is interesting that it says God comes down to see the city. And in one of the commentaries that I read this morning on this passage, someone wrote, it's not that God was nearsighted. The Bible is telling us this in the sense that God, as they try to build up, God comes down. It reminds us that God is above. God is higher than our tallest buildings. God comes down to see our greatest achievements. So the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the men were building. The Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. So that's the story of Babel. You probably all heard that story in Sunday school at some point. And this is a story that actually ends. This story forms a transition between the creation narrative and the story of the beginnings of Israel. So, it's really, there really is a thread here that you can trace from Genesis 1 to Genesis 11. So God begins in Genesis 1 by creating humanity in his image. And they are very good. But from there, it kind of goes downhill, right? Um, Adam and Eve have trouble obeying God. They have trouble getting along with each other. They blame each other. Then their descendants have trouble getting along. Well, their son kills their other son, and then the descendants of their remaining son fill the earth, and they start killing each other. And their problem is they're violent. God sees that violence and says, "I'm going to start over." Floods the earth, starts over with Noah. From Noah and his 3 sons come all these nations, and then these nations begin to build strength and power. They develop new technology, and they, instead of honoring God, they glorify themselves. This is sort of the beginning of nationalism, right? Being prideful in your own power and greatness, rather than what nations should focus on, which is doing the will of God. Instead of glorifying themselves and their greatness, they should focus on justice and peace. But they don't. Um, and you have these self-glorifying nations, and then God scatters them and confuses their language. And so what you have is you have a really good start. God's kind of original intent is to have a creature that is in his image, a creature who is like him, to reflect his glory. Not quite an equal, but an equal in certain respects, an equal in goodness, an equal in truth, an equal in intelligence. That we talked about being in the image of God. Part of that means our ability to reason. So God wants to have this creature who he can see his own glory reflected in. But from there, the gap between God and that creature just gets wider and wider. And so the question this leaves us with in Genesis chapter 11 is, okay, this looks pretty bad. We started out great, being in the image of God. This almost divine creature now is reduced to these nations that are self-glorifying and violent. And so what's God going to do? What's going to happen? And so far, God hasn't totally given up. I mean, even with Noah, he came close to giving up, but he still said, "No, I'm not going to give up on my humans. I'm going to start over, and I'm going to try to make of them what I originally intended, which is a being in my image, an almost divine being." And so now, what are we going to do? And that's the question that should be in your mind right now as we end the story of the Tower of Babel. I will bring up this idea of the nations being scattered and each having their own language, you see in a pretty amazing scene in the book of Acts where the Holy Spirit comes and everyone speaks in tongues, right? But in Acts, what that means is that all the peoples of the earth are there kind of in Jerusalem, and each hears the disciples, the apostles, speak in their own language. So here in Genesis, you have the confusing of languages, and then in the church, you have the beginning of the healing of this wound. Instead of being scattered and confused, languages are now brought together, and people who speak different languages come together and understand each other. So here you have the division of the nations. In the church, you have the healing of the nations. Right? Genesis to Acts. Genesis, division of the nations. The church, the healing of the nations. So in a way, you could look at this story of the Tower of Babel, and the whole rest of the Bible is how God fixes this story. Right? Things went wrong here, and how is God going to put it right? Well, that's what the whole rest of this book is telling. So I really want to emphasize that the Bible does have a single coherent narrative from beginning to end. And I hope that in reading Genesis, we can start to see that. But it really is, it starts with God's creating a being in his image, and that image falling away from him. And how is God going to bring that image back? And that's why I'll say one. I'll not to beat this dead horse, but say one more thing. That's why salvation. When we talk about salvation, so many churches and so many Christians just talk about it as like a get out of hell card, and that's, or maybe at best, it's a ticket to heaven, like a ticket to Disneyland or a nice cruise or something. No, what salvation means is the image of God. Salvation means becoming that original, glorious, nearly divine being that God created us to be. And we're destined or originally designed to be partakers of the divine nature. So to have, not to be God or to replace God, but to have God's holiness, to have God's goodness, to have God's justice, to have God's wisdom, to have God's beauty, to have God's love. That is what we were created for. And so that's what salvation means, is to begin to have God's nature in us. What? Yeah, God help us. Well, that's something pretty remarkable is necessary. And the beginnings, yeah, God help us. And let's see how he does, right? Let's see how God helps us. We're at chapter 11, verse 10. This is the account of Shem. 2 years after the flood, when Shem was 100 years old, he became the father of Arphaxad. I'm going to go fast because this is a genealogy. Arphaxad, and after he became the father of Arphaxad, Shem lived 500 years and had other sons and daughters. When Arphaxad had lived 35 years, he became the father of Shelah, and after he became the father of Shelah, Arphaxad lived 403 years and had other sons and daughters. When Shelah had lived 30 years, he became the father of Eber, and after he became the father of Eber, Shelah lived 403 years and had other sons and daughters. When Eber had lived 34 years, he became the father of Peleg, and after he became the father of Peleg, Eber lived 430 years and had other sons and daughters. When Peleg had lived, and notice only the first child's listed, right? Peleg had lived 30 years, he became the father of Ru, and after he became the father of Ru, Peleg lived 209 years and had other sons and daughters. When Ru had lived 32 years, he became the father of Serug, and after he became the father of Serug, Ru lived 207 years and had other sons and daughters. When Serug had lived 30 years, he became the father of Nahor, and after he became the father of Nahor, Serug lived 200 years and had other sons and daughters. When Nahor had lived 29 years, he became the father of Terah, and after he became the father of Terah, Nahor lived 119 years and had other sons and daughters. After Terah had lived 70 years, he became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. This is the account of Terah. So, God's creation, a reflection of his own divine glory and goodness, has fallen away from him into these nations that are violent and self glorifying. And God is going to do something with this man named Terah and his son Abram. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran, and Haran became the father of Lot. While his father Terah was still alive, Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans, in the land of his birth. That's the land of Babylon. Ur in the land, and Ur was probably the greatest ancient city in Mesopotamia. Abram and Nahor both married. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of both Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was barren; she had no children. Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. Terah lived 205 years, and he died in Haran. So you've got Terah and his son Abram. Abram is married to a woman who is barren. Now, this doesn't look like anything very hopeful, right? Because Abram's got a barren wife. Nothing good is going to come out of this, at least not according to human expectations. Chapter 12. The Lord had said to Abram, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Okay, first is the command. Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. Now, he doesn't even know God doesn't even bother to tell him where. God just says, essentially, get up and leave. And there's a lot to make of that. First, it requires of Abraham a very extreme faith, a lot of trust, right? Because he's saying, leave everything you know, leave what's familiar, leave what's safe, and go to a place that I'll show you, but not now. And life is like that a lot. We have to embark on life and leave behind what's safe and comfortable, and we often don't know how it's going to turn out or where we're going to end up. And so it takes faith to live life in this way. Also, we interpreters have made a big deal out of the first step of a calling is to leave behind what he knows, which was a pagan culture, an idolatrous culture. They worshipped a bunch of gods, and so what God wants to do with Abraham is, okay, your old culture, the life that you used to know, give that up. I'm gonna show you a new way of life, right? And God, in a way, God would have to, right? All these nations are corrupt, and they worship idols, and they're violent. And so if God's going to do anything with this man, he needs to ask this man to sort of purify himself of the corrupt, pagan, idol-worshiping culture that he's from. And that's true. I mean, Christianity has always been like that, right? You come into the church, and you have to let go of your old sinful ways, right? It's this, you could hear this from an old-time Baptist preacher, leave behind your old sinful ways and come live a new life. And that's what God's doing with Abraham. Get out of that culture that is violent and corrupt, and I'm going to take you to a new place, and I'm going to start doing something with you. And through you, I'm going to be on your side All nations will be. So eventually, this question we were left with, all these nations scattered throughout the earth, God's mad at them. What's going to happen to them? Well, someday they're going to be blessed, and it's going to happen through Abraham. Okay, God's not going to, all these nations that he got angry with and punished, eventually he's going to do something good for them. But that good thing is going to start with one man that he says, come away, leave behind everything you know, and I'm going to teach you how to be a human. Right? Any comments or questions?
Didn't he do that with Noah too?
Yes, there's a commonality. God, in a sense, starts over with Noah, although in Noah's case, he literally started over with Noah, and there was no one else. Here, what God has done is God has just scattered all these nations, and his plan for redeeming them is going to have something to do with this man, Abraham, or Abram at this point. With Noah, there were no other people. It was just, I'm going to start with you. But and see, that was, it's a story of sort of God's heartbreak, right? God makes this creature that's supposed to be like him and keeps falling away. In Noah's case, he started over, and they disappointed him again, and God had to punish them again. So God is not going to give up, though. And Abraham is going to be God's plan to put everything right without destroying everybody. I think that's the key difference.
Well, I've been reading Jeremiah in my daily readings, and it's kind of like a repeat of all the stuff that happens in Genesis. All the people are doing evil, and God sends Jeremiah to prophesy to them and to tell them what they need to do, and they just don't listen. They broke the covenant with God, and they just keep going their evil ways, and so they all end up scattered and under the rule of the Babylonians, and it's just, they don't seem to learn.
Yeah, it's the whole Bible is the story over and over again of wandering and redemption, and wandering and redemption. And I think most people's lives are like that. I guess some people maybe figure it out sooner than others, but this is what we do, right? We wander off and we do it our own way, and then God reaches out to us and draws us back. But often next month or next week or next year, we find ourselves going our own way again. But God always pulls us back. It's the Bible is a story of our waywardness and God's faithfulness.
I read the upper room every day, and every so often there'll be somebody in there, and there was one just a couple days ago about how they had drifted away from the Lord, and then a serious illness brought them back to the Lord and the church.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also about, there's also something going on here. Another way to look at this story from a human point of view. I mean, that's God's point of view is kind of what I just described. God says, I'm going to make human beings, and they're going to reflect my greatness and my holiness. And they wander away, but I'm going to keep fixing them. From a human point of view, each of human beings are created with a desire in our hearts, right? We have desire. I mean, we want money, we want power, but why do we want those things? Ultimately, what we want is this fulfillment. We want to become God-like creatures. That's really what we want, and that's actually good. We're supposed to want to become God-like creatures because that's what God's original intent was, is for us to be God-like creatures. And so one way to look at the story of the Bible is this fulfillment of human desire, of what we most want. And we follow our desires but our desire gets sidetracked from its our originally intended desire is to be like God, but that desire gets diverted towards power, towards violence, towards envy and jealousy. And notice the promise in verse 2. What does God say? I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great. What was it that they said when they built the Tower of Babel? We can go back. Look back at Genesis 11, verse 4. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Right? And so, human desire to be a godlike creature, they did it their own, but they did it their own way by building this tower to their own glory. But here, God says, I'm going to give you what you want. You will have your heart's desire. See, God doesn't want to take away our desire. God is not against our desire. God's goal is not to tell us no all the time. God's goal is to give us what we most desire. But we have to do it the right way, not through our own means. And to think it nationally, to be a nation, nations make themselves great by waging war. Nations make themselves great by building the tallest buildings. Nations make themselves great by trying to accumulate wealth. But how does a nation become truly great? God's way is to be just, to do justice, to love mercy, to be obedient to God's commands. That's how a nation becomes great. So yeah, God said, I'll make you a great nation. You want to be great? I will make you great. I will give you what you desire. But we're going to do it not through technology, not through greed, not through war, but we're going to do it through righteousness and through justice. Does that make sense? But I wanted you to see the connection now between what happened at Babel, where they said, we want to make a name for ourselves, and then you see God's promise, I will make your name great. All right, we're at verse 4. So Abraham left as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Now Paul is going to talk about this in Romans. This is what faith looks like. God says, go, leave your old, and I'll show you. Trust me. And Abraham has faith. But faith is not just a feeling. Faith is not just saying, okay, I believe X, Y, and Z. Faith is an action. Abraham acts, and that shows his faithfulness. I'm going to trust you, God, and I'm going to do what you say. Abraham was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. So now Abraham's not thought of the popular depictions of this as, just Abraham and his small family. Actually, Abraham was probably kind of a more like a tribal lord. He was wealthy. He had lots of livestock. He had people with him. This is sort of think of a wandering clan, if you will. That's what we've got here. And so verse 6, Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Morah at Shechem. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. So a repetition of the promise. God takes him to the land of Canaan and says, I'm going to give you this land. This is going to be yours and your descendants. And then Abram responds, right? Just like Jacob did on Sunday. Jacob had the dream of the ladder and God at the top, and Jacob wakes up from the dream and recognizes the place as holy and builds an altar. And so that Abraham does this here. Abraham's obviously before Jacob, but Jacob's following in his grandfather's footsteps. Abram builds an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he went on toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Then Abram set out and continued toward the Negev. Now, verse 10. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. This is a repeated motif. There's a famine, and they go to Egypt. When we read, if those of you who were here when we read Exodus, we know that's how they got into Egypt in the first place. But that happened later on with Jacob and his sons. But Abraham does the same thing. Apparently, Egypt is where you go when there's a famine. Egypt had, because why? Because Egypt's agricultural system was a lot more reliable than Mesopotamia's. And Mesopotamia is right northeast of Egypt, because Egypt has the Nile, and the Nile would rise and fall, and they would plant their crops alongside of it. And there was no comparable river like that or system like that to create a stable base of food in Mesopotamia. So when people in Mesopotamia went hungry, they went to Egypt, where there was food. Verse 11, as he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. Now, why is Abram going to be treated well for her sake? This Abraham is not going to come out well here, because they want to marry her, right? And they'll be nice to Abraham. They'll give him money. They'll give him food. Because they have an agenda, right? And so Abraham's saying, let's lie. One, to save my skin, to protect me, and two, so that people will come give me gifts and try to win your hand in marriage, right? Because yes, if he was her brother, he would have the right to pick her husband, and anyone who wanted to be her husband would need to ingratiate himself to Abram. So this is a very selfish, deceitful thing that we're doing here. And it's not, as we're going to see, not so much in Sarai's benefit. So Abram is not a perfect man. He's selfish, he's deceitful, and he's not a great husband. So here we go, verse 14. When Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that she was a very beautiful woman, and when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. He treated Abram well for her sake, and Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, men servants and maid servants and camels. So it's working out good. It's just as Abram planned, right? He's getting good stuff. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarai, right? Because God knows they're not brother and sister, they're husband and wife. And so God, it's really not very fair, really, because Pharaoh doesn't know better. But God punishes Pharaoh. So Pharaoh summoned Abram. What have you done to me? He said. Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her to be my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go. Get out of here. God's punishing me because of this. You tricked me. You deceived me. Pharaoh's upset. Then Pharaoh gave orders about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything he had. But Abram still's got all the stuff, right? He's got all the animals. He's still, this big win for. That's right. That's right. Not quite fair that Pharaoh was punished for Abram's deceit. But Pharaoh had plenty of stuff. Pharaoh's probably not going to miss it. He'll be all right. All right. Any comments, questions there? We got about 5 minutes left. I think, yeah, we can finish. We can go on to chapter 13 and finish it. So, chapter 13. So, Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him. Now, again, This is telling us, verse 2, Abram had become very wealthy in livestock and in silver and in gold. So now Abram's a rich man. He's got even more people following him, probably possessions, animals. So it's going pretty well for him. Now Lot, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, but the land could not support them while they stayed together. So they've got so many animals that apparently all these animals need to eat, and the land they're in isn't producing enough to feed all of them. So they were not able to stay together. And quarreling arose between Abram's herdsmen and the herdsmen of Lot. So again, it's more than just their families. They've got workers and servants and people following them. The Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in the land at that time. So Abram said to Lot, "Let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herdsmen and mine, for we are brothers. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left." Lot looked up and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, toward Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east. The two men parted company. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. The Lord said to Abram after Lot had parted from him, "Lift up your eyes from where you are and look north and south, east and west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you." So Abram moved his tents and went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he built an altar to the Lord. So again, you have the same pattern: God making a promise and Abram responding with worship. And that's true. Our worship, I mean, yeah, our worship is a response to God's promise. That's what worship is. And what is the reason for our worship? Because God gave us promises. And it's not because we like the music. I know I keep harping on this, but what makes worship meaningful is not the type of worship it is, or what instruments are used, or what songs are sung. Worship is our response to the promises of God. God promises, we build an altar. That's what we're doing every Sunday when we worship. Now, the promise is given now, I think, 3 times. There's a repetition here. It seems like God, I don't know if you felt this way, but God's repeating himself, right? He's given this promise at least 3 times. I will give you this land and I will make your descendants great. But we need that, right? We need to be reminded of God's promises. Why do we gather together every Sunday to hear from the same book? We hear God's promises repeated to us, but we need that. Human beings need to hear those promises over and over again. And it's God's way, I think, of reassuring Abraham. Look, I'm going to keep my promise. This is my promise. Don't forget, this is my promise. So we'll leave Abraham behind here in his tents at Mamre and with his altar to the Lord that he's built as out of gratitude for this promise. And that's what, in the ancient world, that's what they wanted a name for themselves. They wanted to be remembered. They wanted to be great. And God's going to do that for Abram, but in a very different way than the nations try to make a name for themselves, which is what? Through war and greed. And it's not really different. Nations still try to make a name for themselves by war and greed. And God holds out a different way. All right, I'm going to leave. Any questions though? We've done good work. We've gotten through, Genesis 1 through 11 is what's called the primeval history. from creation to the beginning of the nations. And chapter 12 begins what we call the patriarchal narratives, the story of Abraham and his children. So I look forward to next week, and we'll pick up the story of Abraham. God bless.